Okay, so very pleased to have for this final session Bruno Waterfield, who's the Brussels correspondent for the Daily Telegraph and has been since December 2006. And he's been reporting on European affairs for 11 years, first from Westminster, then from Brussels since January 2003. He's the author of EHU, Politics Behind Closed Doors, published by the Manifesto Club, and a regular contributor to Spite, which is a publication that I also write for. So without further ado, speaking on overthrowing authority, authenticity, rebellion, and a new subjection, we have Bruno.
Last year I got the 1930s, this year I got 1960s. Short straw. I'm not going to be talking about Europe at all, although you'll hear at sort of length sometimes from some European thinkers and some European thinkers here in America. In looking at this period, I'm very aware of the scope of what I'm trying to cover and what I'm trying to collapse into this one session. And I'm very aware of the fact that I've sort of scratched at the tip of the iceberg, but I do see it as a beginning. For the context and the framing of it, I've focused on America because it is there, in a society that at the time was the most successful in the history of humanity. And I believe that it was there that what we call the 60s was most fully realised. I am, as I did last year, going to use a lot of primary sources and use some long quotes from some of these people to try and capture the spirit of the time. So be warned, if you're of a sensitive disposition, that the F word crops up quite a lot because this is the 1960s after all. I'm also going to make a few assertions and arguments that will need to be tested out in discussion afterwards. Firstly, I want to note, although this will come up later, that the so-called permissiveness of the 60s, which I would defend, was not the work of the radical critics of American society. It was accomplished by others, or by secular trends, and many of the artefacts or developments that the 60s radical left take credit for were actually parasitic on other developments of the work of other people. The 60s was a product, not a producer, of the slow erosion of conservatism and the failure of liberalism. But as a product and as a moment, it unleashed new dynamics and new forces, and because this was in America, they were instantly transmitted to the world at large. American writers of the 1950s were already pronouncing America beat. Allen Ginsberg had declared a culture war in 1956 with his poem America, and it has real resonances, this kind of language. I'm just going to quote. America, I've given you all, and now I'm nothing. America, $2.27, January 17, 1956. I can't stand my own mind. America, when will we end the human war? Go fuck yourself with your atom bomb. I don't feel good, don't bother me. I won't write my poem till I'm in my right mind. America, when will you be angelic? When will you take off your clothes? Etc, etc. I'll spare you the rest because you've got Jerry Rubin to look forward to a little bit later on. Key to the transformation of American culture in the 1960s was the inability of America's conservative elite to hold the line, any line. I'll come to the sort of sex permissiveness a bit later on. I want to illustrate this by taking a quick look at the Vietnam War. I choose the Vietnam War because this is one of the sort of things that the radical left take credit for. So let's be clear. Again, there's a lot of myth-making. Opposition to the war did not modify America's Vietnam policy at any point in the 60s. The problems faced by the state in prosecuting that conflict were internally generated. So, for example, the Pentagon Papers came from within the heart of the American elite and people around McNamara. For example, it wasn't the radical left who did that bit of work either. Domestic opposition had less to do with any form of principled anti-imperialism or a consistent support of self-determination for Vietnamese people or other people in the Third World as it was known at the time, and more of a homegrown American anti-Americanism, a bit like the sort of sentiment that Ginsburg was expressing. Key to the loss of conservative America's foreign policy mission was the crisis of imperial self-image and ideas of racial superiority that had been severely discredited by the Nazi Holocaust in the Second World War. In 1966, Muhammad Ali famously registered his opposition to the Vietnam War with a crack at the highly racialised domestic politics of America at a time when the civil rights conflict was pushing political structures to breaking point. "No Viet Cong ever called me nigger," he said. Now, he had a good point, but interestingly enough, the American establishment never portrayed, or never consistently, or the American establishment never portrayed the Vietnamese as niggers. In large part because the notion of a superiority of a white race was so contested at home. The inability to assert the traditional doctrine of white superiority over the Asiatic made projecting American power by force much more difficult. As outlined by Mick Hume in his 1995 essay, Hiroshima the White Man's Bomb, America was far less restrained in the Second World War conflict with Japan, when the enemy was routinely racialised, culminating in the atomic bombing of 2 Japanese cities. Hume argues that America's bombing of Hiroshima was motivated by determination to shape the post-war era in Asia, an act unprecedented since, justified by the betrayal or the betrayal of the Japanese as subhuman. Franklin D. Roosevelt, perhaps the 20th century's greatest US president and a saint of American liberalism, was no different from other members of the elite in this respect, with his idea that the Japanese were evil because their skulls were 2,000 years less developed than the white man's. In a letter justifying his decision to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, his successor as president, Harry S. Truman, wrote, "The only language they seem to understand is the one we've been using to bombard them. When you have to deal with a beast, you have to treat him as a beast. It is most regrettable, but nevertheless true." In the Korean conflict 5 years later, race still played a supporting role to an imperialist ideology based on anti-communism rather than open assertions of white superiority, although of course the conflict did give us the word gook as a racial slur. In 1953, as the North refused to negotiate a wholesale release of prisoners, President Eisenhower threatened to resume hostilities, quote, "without inhibition in our use of weapons," a thinly veiled threat to use atomic bombs. The threat was not made in the Vietnamese War during the 60s, not even after the devastating blow for American and white prestige after the Tet Offensive in January 1968. The destructive playing out of the race question domestically and the discrediting of imperialist tradition restricted the ability of America to act in Vietnam as it had acted in Japan or threatened to act in Korea. In 1964, the Republicans chose Barry Goldwater as a presidential candidate, a doctrinaire conservative, but a very talented, he was seen as a very serious contender, who argued that nuclear weapons should be treated more like conventional weapons and used in Vietnam. His slogan for the campaign was, "In your heart, you know he is right." The Democrats, using the nuclear issue to devastating effect, countered, "In your guts, you know he's nuts." Lyndon B. Johnson, the Democrat candidate, rose with 61% of the vote, the biggest landslide in American history. So it was okay to nuke the Japs in 1945, but when a traditional doctrinaire conservative hinted that they maybe could do that to win the war in Vietnam, he got hammered in an election. Opponents to the war focused less on the right of Asian nations to self-determination free of outside interference, as much as a cultural critique of American imperialism as being American. Illustrating the erosion of the idea that the US was superior, the influential book Tragedy of American Diplomacy by William Appleman Williams, a New Left historian in 1959, located the problem and the idea that American foreign policy was as much a cultural imperialism as a military one. An idea entertained by many Americans, he wrote, insists that other people cannot really solve their problems and improve their lives unless they go about it in the same way as the US. In some cases, the American way of doing things simply does not work for other people. America's slow-mo Vietnam defeat was nothing to do with anti-war protesters and everything to do with the American elite's incoherence. Opposition to the war was more driven by disenchantment with the American way of life as any principled anti-imperialism. But more important in shaping the peculiar and particular form of the 60s moment was the spectacular and destructive failure of American liberalism to deliver political and state responses to manage conflict. I want, and again it's going to have to be very brief, a sprint, look at the domestic issue of race and civil rights in America as pushed onto the political agenda by the successful civil rights protests against segregation in the South. And when I say successful, they highlighted the issue and made it possibly the central, probably the central domestic issue in American politics in the 1960s. The American state's military machine was so advanced that it could put a man on the moon, but the political apparatus was so primitive that it could not manage the civil rights question, although it was entirely straightforward in law, or even a few thousand revolting students. How was it that the most successful society in history, with a liberal constitution to die for, was not able to manage a demonstration of 500 students at Kent State University, Ohio, in 1970, without the National Guard gunning down and killing 4 of them? Conservatives could not hold the line, and liberalism failed as America's political structures and organisation were unable to contain conflicts that were relatively, certainly in terms of European levels of class struggle or social conflict, insignificant. The students, who according to many accounts turned America on its head, were totally unrepresentative of universities, let alone the nation. John Robert Green, Professor of History at Syracuse University, in his very student-sympathetic account of 60s America, notes that New Left students were always in the minority on college campuses, a microscopic minority, he says. The turmoil over civil rights seems all the more bizarre because the political establishment were all agreed that an injustice needed to be remedied. Apart from the paranoid anti-communist hawks in the FBI spying on Martin Luther King in his bedroom, the US establishment recognised that King had right on his side, albeit they regarded him as a sort of pain in the neck as well. Additionally, as we saw earlier, the American elite could no longer explicitly assert racial superiority or pass off inequality as a product of black inferiority. During the Second World War, almost 1 million blacks served in uniform. Soldiers who had fought in a war that in the European theatre at least had been billed as a war for freedom, they, along with many of their other white comrades from the army, were less willing to acquiesce to traditional American racism. The war economy and labour shortages had drawn black people into manufacturing and processing, a huge increase, quite a phenomenal increase, from 50,000 to 1.2 million. It's an increase of 240%. And that really changed the dynamic, generating a new layer of well-organised and even middle-class campaigners. Racism had played a historically important role to America's domestic order, not just in the South, but in the big northern cities, to divide and rule the urban working class, and as a conservative explanation for inequality in the land of the free. In Detroit, 97% of the police force was white. Black unemployment in the cities was 30% in 1966. The national joblessness rate for all Americans was 3.8%. 40% of blacks lived below the poverty lines compared to 15% as an average for all Americans. But America had changed, leaving the American elite both unable to racialise politics or to dispense with an outlook that racialised inequality. And that's a very, very difficult place to be. In a keynote 1965 speech, President Johnson tried to address a century of oppression, hatred and justice, but found that he could not himself dispense with the old ideas. Perhaps, he said, perhaps most important, its influence radiating to every part of life is the breakdown of the Negro family structure, he said. The speech, entitled To Fulfill These Rights, backfired completely boomeranged back on him. The civil rights people were furious. The impasse, compounded by the character of the American state, modelled not on democracy, but on a classical liberal republic, the impasse was compounded by the character of the American state. Conflicts in the US are not handled by political structures, such as acts of Congress or programs of parties, but rather by judges and bureaucratic bodies, such as an obscure sort of EU-style agency called the Interstate Commerce Commission, that was the body that desegregated Greyhound bus diners, later backed up, of course, by the federal, state and National Guard. Classic reformism, voter registration, rights under the Constitution, were issues that the American state was unable to deal with. Federal bodies could not stop state-sponsored mobs, so mobs organised by the authorities in Mississippi, for example, organised by local politicians and policemen, attacking people for exercising their rights under the liberal US Constitution. In fact, when push came to shove and a massacre was imminent, Kennedy or Johnson would have to send the National Guard down to Birmingham. In 1964, a woman called Fannie Lou Hamer horrified the Democratic National Convention with her account of her attempts to register her vote in Mississippi. Describing her repeated beatings after her arrest and her jailing for trying to vote, Hamer recounted the screams of another woman in the cell next to her who was also being beaten. She was being called a nigger and being told to say, "Yes, sir." They beat her, I don't know for how long. All this on account we want to register, to become citizens. I question America, she said. In this context, it is perhaps not surprising that people felt compelled to turn away from structures or even organisation itself altogether when the allegedly rational route of politics, of voting, was manifested as unreason, imprisonment and a beating at the hands of the police in contradiction to American law and the American Constitution. The impossibility of a social democratic moment, the inability of directly coercive state or judicial institutions, there were no intermediary political parties or anything in a way, this is direct state interventions to manage the conflict, pushed people away from the very idea of structures or traditional reformist organisation, such as trade unions, to far more unpredictable forms of politics. The failure of political structures, the unreason of the state, despite its declared rights in a constitutional order, unleashed some destructive forces. One new left tactic that took on a life of its own was that of direct action. In his famous letter from Birmingham jail, King explained, "Non-violent direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension in that a community that has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. It seeks to so dramatise the issue that it can no longer be ignored," he wrote. For King, the tactic was tied into a liberal approach to use political structures and organisation to enter into a negotiation on reform or compromise. So he wanted to deliver a shock, delivered by TV cameras to every American home, and that would force the authorities to negotiate with them. So already, from a fairly desperate position. But others, particularly on the student left, saw potential for the tactic as an end in itself. Especially via television, staged provocations and protests could have a huge impact beyond any kind of real representation of political influence as previously defined by organisation, numbers, members, or votes. I just want to quote Jerry Rubin. I'm going to come back to him later on. We will do whatever is forbidden. We will outrage America, spelled with K of course, until the bourgeoisie dies of apoplexy. We will turn America's colleges into nudist camps. The approach further forced and fueled the turn away from structures, building alliances or working with others to define interests, accelerating fragmentation and the avoidance of practical politics. As the thinker Christopher Lasch observed, the attempt to dramatise official repression, however, imprisoned the left in a politics of theatre, of dramatic gestures, of style without substance, a mirror of the unreality which it should have been the purpose of the left to unmask. It has to be stressed, though, that the emergence of identity politics, politics of theatre, was a product of all-round defeat, both of the oppressed, particularly the civil rights movement, I'm not so sympathetic for the students, in the battle to get their rights, and for the upholders of order, these structures had failed. It was an all-round defeat. The rejection of structures, whilst also driven by the unreason of the political order, was also a form of avoidance, of running away. Now, traditionally in politics and political conflict, it was handled in America by people running away, going west. Essentially, obviously, by the 1960s, America is full up and there's nowhere to run to, so people had to find other ways to avoid a political resolution. Instead of the work needed in the formation of interest with other people or groups, there was a turning away from the rationality of politics to other forms of agency. For Herbert Marcuse, in his highly influential 1964 book, One-Dimensional Man, the break was total. He wrote, "Contrasted with the fantastic and insane aspects of its rationality, the realm of the irrational becomes the home of the really rational, of the ideas that may promote the art of life." In an argument that prefigured the straights versus freaks division of American society, which I'll come to in a minute, Marcuse turns his back on traditional politics to posit a revolutionary agency without consciousness. I'm going to go into quite a long quote, but it's really important because he's writing in 1964 and he effectively predicts the black separatists, Black Panthers, and other people such as the Weathermen years down the road. And I think it's also really important, given who he was and his background, to note his self-conscious pessimism, even discussed. And it really is an almost uncanny prophecy. He's writing this in 1964. The book's been written before the Berkeley Free Speech movement. So this is Marcuse. Underneath the conservative popular base is the substratum of the outcasts and outsiders, the exploited and persecuted of other races and other colours, the unemployed and the unemployable. They exist outside the democratic process. Their life is the most immediate and the most real need for ending intolerable conditions and institutions. Thus, their opposition is revolutionary, even if their consciousness is not. Their opposition hits the system from without and is therefore not deflected by the system. It is an elementary force which violates the rules of the game, and in doing so reveals it as a rigged game. When they get together and go out into the streets without arms, without protection, in order to ask for the most primitive civil rights, they know that they face dogs, stones, bombs, jail, concentration camps, even death. Their force is behind every political demonstration for the victims of law and order. The fact that they start refusing to play the game may be the fact which marks the beginning of the end of a period. Nothing indicates it will be a good end. A note of pessimism that is striking, even of disgust that is striking. 6 years later, the logic of Marcuse's call is taken up by Bernadine Dawn as she delivered the first communique of the Weatherman underground organisation on the 21st of May 1970, a group of radical New Left students that took the politics of theatre to its logical conclusion by declaring war on America. Freaks are revolutionaries, and revolutionaries are freaks. If you want to find us, this is where we are. In every tribe, commune, dormitory, farmhouse, barracks and townhouse, where kids are making love, smoking dope and loading guns, she said. Inevitably enough, Dawn is now an associate professor of law. She did a year of prison, only a year of prison, after turning herself in 1980 with another Weatherman leader, Bill Ayers, her husband. His family then got her a job in the Sidley Austin law firm by a firm with her family connections with her husband. And you can see why she got off with a year. Via Marcuse and the Weatherman, we can see how quickly a rebellion based on the celebration of unreason becomes the dominant force with degenerative effects. The free speech movement at Berkeley University in 1964 was a high point of the student movement, probably the only high point. It was quickly corrupted by the infantilism of political theatre. Protest in 1964 unusually involved thousands of students, probably the majority at America's biggest university. And it was sparked when a college authorities banned sort of stalls or tables that were set out on the corner of two streets, and it just so happened that the little patch of land on the corner of the streets was owned by the university, so the university would say, we're exercising our property rights, so we're going to stop you doing that. You aren't protected by the Constitution because it's our property, so your rights don't apply. And there was a massive campaign against it, massive protests, and they were a bit like civil rights protests because there was a sort of tradition of activism there. They were disciplined, they were well organised, they didn't seek futile, dumb confrontations with the police. In fact, they were attacked by the police. And it was quite a respectable, quite a powerful campaign, and engaged a lot of people and had quite an interesting, positive dynamic, and it was actually based around free speech. But as the college authorities failed to deal with a very reasoned and reasonable campaign to get the tables back, the free speech movement quickly degenerated. Jerry Rubin, who attended Berkeley in 1964 but dropped out to focus on social activism, becoming one of the founders of the Youth International Party, or Yippies, gave his account in his book, Scenarios of the Revolution. If you really want to read it, but it's hard work. So this is his tale. A group of free people sat down on free speech and anti-war protests in January 1965 with signs saying, "Fuck war." They were arrested. Over to Rubin. Language is one of the first things to go. No one really communicates with words anymore. Words have lost their emotional impact, intimacy, ability to shock and make love. Language prevents communication. But there's one word which America, spelled with a K, hasn't destroyed. One word which has maintained its emotional power and purity. America, spelled with a K, cannot destroy it because she dare not use it. It's illegal. It's the last word left in the English language. Fuck. The emergence of what the Yippies called the filthy speech movement split the campus and gave the authorities a carte blanche to discredit protesters. For once, media coverage was not on the side of the New Left. The Berkeley student newspaper editorialised that there is absolutely no need for a filthy speech moment. Rubin was not impressed. Most political radicals, he wrote, got uptight and wouldn't defend fuck. They said fuck wasn't serious. They got a sudden pure speech fetish. Joe Freeman, a contemporary of Rubin at Berkeley, one of those unhappy with his filthy speech movement, wrote in or around 1971 an essay called The Tyranny of Structurelessness. It was one of the additional readings circulated. The essay was a reaction against the rejection of structures in the radical movement, specifically the feminist movement in her case. It is a fascinating insight into the dead end of a political movement based on consciousness raising and rap groups where students got together to listen to their voices of unreason and to discuss their damage at the hands of American society. Roxanne Dunbar, a feminist writer, gives a flavour of what the revolutionary discussions were like. She wrote, talking about a discussion in one of these groups, "We are damaged, we women. We are damaged, and we have the right to hate and have contempt and to kill and to scream. But for what? How can we possibly settle for anything remotely less than total annihilation of a system which systematically destroys half its people?" The hysterical language is, of course, far less dignified or persuasive than the testimony of Fannie Lou Hamer, who was imprisoned and beaten while trying to register to vote. The rap group set up by people like Dunbar didn't have voting or any formal structures. Freeman was worried because feminism had traditionally sought structures such as universal suffrage. She writes, or wrote, "Much of the energy of past women's movements has been directed to having the structures of decision-making and the selection processes formalised so that the exclusion of women could be confronted directly," she wrote. But 1960s radicalism a la Marcuse had become estranged and opposed to rational structures, the basic tenets of egalitarian or democratic organisation fought for and established in the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries. Freeman was aware of the problem, and her essay was a doomed attempt to restore some of the gains of human society thrown out by radicals. And if you read it, you really get a flavour of what these so-called movements were like, and her 7 points at the end are the most basic principles of organisation. I mean, they're not even that good, but they are the most principle. And if these people had ditched that, then they really were throwing everything away. And so Freeman wrote, "Only if we refuse to relate or interact on any basis whatsoever could we approximate structurelessness, and that is not the nature of a human group," she wrote. "People need structures and rational rules and means to relate to each other in order to work out our interests, and then in order to work towards established shared objectives. For the realm of freedom to become a realm of sovereignty, to move from intention to resolution, it is necessary to have shared structures and principles." The 1960s saw the rise of the idea that the personal is political, a trend that became entrenched in the 1970s mainstream. Its origin is said to lie in a key book by C. Wright Mills, The Sociological Imagination, 1959, in which he argued that social scientists needed to translate private troubles into public issues. The new identity politics popularised the idea that social or public norms of civilization are destructive to the self. Self-realisation becomes the destruction of or the refusal of those norms. Personal is political, and it's fascinating to see how quickly the sort of nihilism of this new left comes to emulate the conservative attempt to overthrow free will. The issue of sex, or rather sexual repression, was key to this process because it's a problem of identity shared by everybody. It is important to underline that sex as consciousness raising has nothing to do with sexual revolution or permissiveness, a trend that started much earlier and that was very much part of mainstream American culture by the end of the 1950s. Hippies did not invent the pill, they couldn't even organise music festivals. As Green observes, for the radical, quote, "sex offered as much as a societal cleansing as it did for an opportunity for individual hedonism." As Maurice Brinton wrote in his 1975 Solidarity pamphlet, The Irrational in Politics, again circulated as an additional reading. I really urge you to read it. It's a really good exposition of the marrying of a really good Marxist, really clever guy, marrying all this sort of bullshit in with it, merging them, fusing them together. He wrote, "The assertion of the right to manage one's own life in the realm of sex, as in the realm of work, is helping to disintegrate the dominant ideology. It is producing less compulsive and obsessional individuals, and in this respect, preparing the ground for libertarian revolution." Instead of, or for Brinton alongside the old-fashioned pursuit of democratic rights or old-fashioned trade union organisation, revolutionaries could seek liberation by challenging sexual repression. urging people to do what they were doing anyway and what they wanted to do was probably a bit of a bonus for square Marxists such as Brinton, who was born in 1947 and was married to the same woman all his life. Brinton saw the family as the key for the formation of a psychic structure which corresponds to the existing social order in all strata of the population. Here's a longish quote. He wrote, "For rulers to continue ruling, it is necessary that those at the bottom of the social ladder not only accept their condition, but eventually lose even the sense of being exploited. Once this psychological process has been achieved, the division of society becomes legitimised in people's minds. The exploited cease to perceive it as something imposed on them from without. The oppressed have internalised their own oppression. They tend to behave like robots, programmed not to rebel against the established order. The robots may even seek to defend their subordinate position, to rationalise it, and will often reject as pie in the sky any talk of emancipation. They are often impermeable to progressive ideas." In one sense, it's not surprising that the family was in the firing line for radicals. Going back to that Johnson speech on civil rights, he insisted the family is the cornerstone of our society. But whether the politicisation of a family comes from left or right, its consequence tends to be negative. The focus on psychology and upbringing as the determinant of character attacks the role of the development of the mind. Lionel Trilling in Sincerity and Authenticity, which is a wonderful book that every human being should own, unpacks the nihilism of a radical anti-family outlook and its absolutist hostility to educational moral influence. Quote, "The only principle for societal action which may be thought to emerge is wholly and blandly negative, since the self of the infant can maintain its pristine authenticity only if the process of its maturation is self-determined. It follows that we must not give our assent to any form of rearing, education or socialisation in which prescriptive influence has a part." The assault on selfhood went as far as an attack on the mind itself, with a proclamation by all kinds of thinkers, but by also many on the radical left, that insanity was a more authentic form of selfhood than sanity. R.D. Laing's 1960 bestseller, The Divided Self, was primarily a case for a more humane existential psychiatry. It was published by Tavistock at the Institute. It wasn't published by a big sort of, it became a bestseller. Making the point that a schizophrenic, quote, "must remain incomprehensible to us as long as we are sane and he is insane." But his argument that psychosis is, quote, "an outcome of a divided self, or the tension between the two personas within us, one our authentic private identity and the other our false, sane self that we present to the world, would, as we've seen, be inevitably taken up beyond the world of therapeutic practice. Or, as he wrote, in the context of our present pervasive madness that we call normality, sanity, freedom, all our frames of reference are ambiguous and equivocal." By 1967, in Politics of Experience and Bird of Paradise, he extended his ideas to cover wider health and society, concluding that psychosis is, quote, "a voyage of discovery and transcendence. It is the world that is insane." The idea that the inner self can be unleashed to subsume or transcend the public self strikes at the heart of the mind and of personality itself. Hobbes in Leviathan, a book written over 300 years before that, made the point that, quote, "secret thoughts of man run over all things, holy, profane, clean, obscene, grave and light, without shame or blame, which verbal discourse cannot do, farther than the judgment shall approve of the time, place and persons." In other words, selfhood is based on a form of repression within the mind. An individual who could not repress or separate inner feeling from its articulation and action would widely be regarded as insane or suffering a form of mental illness. It is unlikely that such a self could function in a society. In any possible society, then, there is a necessity, a difference between the inner individual and his outer public face. As I said, such a necessity is necessary in all societies, any society that I could imagine. The articulation of a feeling in our inner selves is kept separate from acting it out, from realising it. We can admit sexual desires or violent impulses to ourselves without ripping off our clothes or lashing out with our fists. The necessity of a private self and a public self is a prerequisite of practical freedom. Without a mind, we cannot be autonomous and free. I just want to end on trilling. It really hits the nail on the head, because obviously no one is really saying let's all go mad. No one is really proposing as a practical option or as a strategy that people lose their minds. And what trilling identifies is that the sort of cult of madness, a cult of authenticity, is an escape or an attempt to escape from the rigour of authority and responsibility. So, this is a quote to end with. We understand a priori prescriptions of society pervert human existence and destroy his authenticity. And he's just referring back to a huge, long literature going back for over 100 years of that case. The enthusiasm for Lang is a response not to the originality of his conception, but to its extremity. His inculpation of society, or his blame of society, comes so near to being absolute that it is experienced as liberation, if not, alas, from the bondage of social necessity, but at least from the duress of its moral authority. Thank you very much.
So we have a good 45 minutes for questions and points. So again, to give Bruno a bit of a rest, I'll take a few hands and then we'll come back to you, Bruno. So yeah, start with Philip at the front.
Bruno, thank you very much for that. It was great, and it took me back really. I just two points I wanted to make. One is a book club point, which is I've relatively recently read American Pastoral by Philip Roth, and that seems to me to make more sense of the 60s in America in an incredibly depressing way than anything I've read before or since. And if you haven't read it, I'd recommend it.
It was one of the recommended readings.
Oh right, I beg your pardon, sorry, I possibly didn't say it. It's read it there, God. The second point I wanted to make is that I imagine from what you said, you don't subscribe to the revisionist view of Lyndon Johnson's domestic successes in terms of the legislation that did go through during 64 to 68 period in relation to Medicare, Medicaid, civil rights legislation, and to the if only Bobby Kennedy hadn't been shot view that the world would have been a different place. And I'd just be interested in your thoughts about that.
I'm going to take Pete Smith, then was that your hand there? No, okay, sorry, Neil Davenport, then Jason Smith.
Okay, we're taking up a lot of mythologies, and by the way, Bruno's excellent towards the end. When a lot of 60s myths are taken up, there is a tendency to be a bit empirical with the way that it's formulated. It certainly was the case that more people were right-wing in the 1960s than perhaps are given credit for, and the British historian Dominic Sandbrook always makes the point in the books that he wrote in the 1960s. He will point out that the fact that the sound of music sold more than the Beatles is proof that perhaps the 60s revolution wasn't as widespread as may have been the case. And I think there's elements of that is certainly true. But I think what was taking place as to why the American establishment overreacted was more the fear that it couldn't infuse bourgeois kids within the Western way of life. So it doesn't matter how small they were in terms of campus numbers, the fact you couldn't enthuse people around the Western way of life was more the concern. I mean, Nixon gives the game away, he's talking about the silent majority. But if it's silent, that kind of suggests they're actually not actively enthusing the Western way of life. And so it's more of that process of the inability to enthuse people along the Western way of life as to why there was a panicked overreaction to what was taking place. The second point I want to raise, I've got a slight issue as to whether post-1945 race was no longer an issue. I think there was a tension in the sense that explicit racial language couldn't be used in the way that it was before the Second World War, but it was still an important ideological glue at the same time. So during that period, I suppose you can characterise it more of a silent race war rather than an explicit race war. Just give you an example, even as something as late as the 1988 presidential election, the Democrats were put on the defensive as seen as being too soft on black criminality. I can't remember the name of the black rapist who got let out early. So race was still very much an issue, and I would even argue that in the 1970s, that's where you had that galvanising of a conservative constituency, usually around the issue of race, in particular on black criminality. So I'm not, unless I'm not entirely convinced whether...
My whole point was that Johnson, when he gave his great keynote speech as a new president on fulfilling civil rights, the whole point was he couldn't escape from a racist analysis of black inequality. So there was no other explanation why everyone who's unemployed in Detroit is black, because they're black. But what I'm saying is that the ability to assert that, dogmatically, and to organise around it is very complicated when people who are trying to register their vote and assert really basic constitutional rights are being, clubbed, shot, and burned in Mississippi. Your ability to use that racial ideology, which is being discredited on the television screens that evening of your speech, becomes very, very difficult. And the shift to criminality, which is in the new right, and Nixon, it's Nixon's great triumph, is to make crime the issue, not race. They may use the image of a black man, but they don't talk about black crime, they talk about crime. They'll use images, and we all know who we're talking about, but they don't talk about black crime per se. So it was a weakening, something that did work for the American League, particularly in northern cities in terms of dividing the working class, and something that actually a lot of local politics was organised around. It was no longer something you could feel secure in, because it was embarrassing to you. When you had some of these like redneck police chiefs, down in the south, and the sort of antics they were getting up to. This is like 2 decades after the war, and some of the people who are fighting these court cases are decorated American servicemen who flew airplanes against the Nazis. Then it becomes really pretty complicated.
That's right. Okay, I'm going to take Jason, then Ken, then Dolan. I'll go to these two hands over there.
Yeah, thanks, Bruno. Really enjoyed that. I think we can all recognise the picture that you're painting. We certainly all recognise where the idea of the personalist political has led, and you see the birth of the therapeutic gaze in this period. With one sort of slightly odd example I've noticed he's cropping up lately is that the popularity of Motown is kind of suggested as something that really tackled racism, racial thinking in that period. I mean, there may or may not be something in that sort of cultural analysis. You can also see, I think, where blaming individuals for their own bad opinions comes from, in the sense of we're all sponges for the media, and we just take on board everything that we see on TV and that we don't have free will. But there's just a couple of examples of groups which I don't think fit into the overall picture that you're painting quite so easily, which is the Black Panthers, where you do have a move away from the non-violent protests, which I think are equally nihilistic, and also the Gay Liberation Front, which bizarrely actually addressed the various meetings of the Black Panthers in 72, but probably did not marry each other. So I'm not saying that I'm not saying I don't recognise the picture you're painting, but there were other things going on.
Thanks, Chris.
I don't know if this is a point, a question, of a stream of consciousness. So bear with me, but I was really interested in what you said. And when you look at, so you mentioned Jerry Rubin and the sort of the yippies. If you look at that sort of period, they acknowledged that they turned inwards because they had been defeated. I mean, Jerry Rubin said that they had tried to take on the American state and they got hammered. And that was no longer an option. So they turned towards the sort of self, was to try, in their view, was one by one to change everybody's individual consciousness. And Rubin, I think Rubin's quote was that gradually you would reach a tipping point, you'd have revolution one by one. I think the term was that there's a policeman in my head, he must be destroyed. So it was to challenge all those sort of social structures that were making people, say, saying it racist, sexist, and stuff. So it was a reaction against Freud and repression with it. I think we get criticised for what they were trying to achieve was socialism in one person. Sort of around it. But interesting then, because as they gave up in sort of class of taking on the state, they tried to turn to other groups, and they turned to the black community and the race awareness of things, which were a disaster, because the Black Panthers and people seen that this individual focus was taking away their strength, their collective strength, sort of with it. And the other interesting sort of point about that was that they then turned their gaze to sort of homosexuality and then took over a convent to experiment in the convent. 2 years later, the convent was closed down, apart from 6 nuns that were left, but they were now radical lesbian nuns. There was this sort of release of all this kind of desire. There's lots of this taking place. And just, I suppose, a final point, a little defence of Lang. I know he sort of went off the wall at times, but I think one of the important insights he gave for therapeutic practice was this about understanding, trying to understand the reality from the patient's perspective, which confined to a clinical setting, I think is absolutely fine. And again, if you look at what's developed with mental health movements and how they try to understand madness, at least he was trying to, in a sense, look outwards. We can see now, if you look at the mental health movements now, they try to locate madness to do with past child abuse. They're very much influenced by this sort of abuse, determination of abuse that we have today. I think it was more a stream of consciousness, wasn't it?
Thanks. Yeah, I'm interested in what makes America particularly peculiar about this and how these kind of trends develop there. And there are some very specific things about America, not just at the time, but as a legacy of its history. One thing is to look at the civil rights movement, which obviously inspired the civil rights movement in Ireland, very consciously. The Martin Luther King was evoked there, and even the kind of stage provocations you're talking about were part of that. If you think of the famous footage of the black and white images of the priest being beaten by police and shouting out loud, and there was all this kind of sense that they were being victimized in the same way, could identify. But very quickly, instead of turning into a theatre of politics, the way you described, you have a more genuine political trend, the development of the modern Republican movement. And I wonder to what extent that's to do with a different response by the state. There may be something in that. But what's certainly true is that the Irish Catholics had a Republican tradition that went back for as long as, since when black people in America were slaves and had no possibility of organisation. But there was that political resource that they could draw on, and obviously led to a much more political response. Again, declaring war, but with somewhat more credibility than the American left. So obviously there are also differences in terms of class politics in the US and Europe. But America's lack of tradition, in a sense, a lack of independent tradition outside of elite politics was, I think, leading into the kind of trends that we described. So I wonder how much it's about, how much it's about.
So Bruno's going to come back briefly. I'm going to start with Harley, then Jacob, and then work way to the back.
Johnson's Civil Rights Bill. The Civil Rights Bill was already, right at the beginning when it was drafted, was a sort of unhappy compromise for the Civil Rights movement. But it really did get gutted be passed, showing some of it was gutted to be passed. And in fact, the 1964 Civil Rights Bill is directly consequential to the beginnings of the splinter groups that became the Black Panthers Party. For example, I'm actually not one of those people who admires the Black Panthers Party. Particularly, I mean, it looked good, I suppose, but everyone looked good then. I actually think that yes, they were, activists, and they were involved in the sort of confrontations that were taking place. And at the time, they were alongside a lot of these white radical lefties as well. I have to say that I far more admire the people who carried on, plugging away at voter registration. So even though the Civil Rights Bill made it a bit easier to do voter registration, there was still sort of complicated literacy tests that were seen as discriminating against some people anyway. So I have to say that I far more admire people like Martin Luther King, who just carried on trying and have built pretty incredible organisations in countries and communities that didn't have histories of them. And I suspect that it was the sort of presence of sort of scattered like yeast throughout his organisation of these sort of white radical students that actually helped weaken the civil rights movement at various times. I really admire the reformism of people who put all that work into really trying to build something. And sort of everyone always focuses on the Black Panthers sort of Declaration of Independence of the United States. We hold these truths to be self-evident, and all these sort of 10 demands. We want freedom, we want full employment, we want an end to the robbery by that capitalist, in capital letters, of our black community, decent housing, blah, 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 blah. But of course, where they were being pulled was in the same direction as all the sort of armed struggle groups went, in pretty futile, pointless shootouts with the police and a kind of suicidal confrontation. Of course, Jerry Rubin didn't actually have the guts to follow his comrades into the government. He became an entrepreneur, a lifestylist instead. So I think the less said about him, the better. I think the difference between the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland and the civil rights movement in America was, as you said, the Republican tradition, but also the fact that Northern Ireland was part of Ireland. It was part of a nation. And the problem that the civil rights people were coming up against in terms of the American state was the fact that whilst America has a state and is a nation state, it's quite difficult to see that there's a demos or a nation there.
Thanks so much, Bruno. Right, there's a lot of hands. I will get everyone, but I'm going to start with Harley, then move to Jacob, then there's two hands right at the back. So yeah.
Okay, I wholeheartedly agree with your point about the radical left taking unfair credit for Vietnam. It reminded me of something I read recently in a book called Too Big to Know by a chap, I think he's called David Weinberger. It's very influential in technology and information circles, and he's got a lot of interesting things to say about the internet and the potential that access to knowledge and different perspectives offers us. But what he said about Vietnam, and it's about why America got into Vietnam, was that JFK was a white, well-educated man. His advisors were white, well-educated men, and basically they formed an echo chamber and reinforced each other's views, and that's why they made this terrible, terrible mistake. And if only they'd opened up the discussion to a wider group of people, they would have got different perspectives, and it wouldn't have happened. And that, to me, is the example of what Ellie was talking about earlier, which is looking at a historical event, not in political terms, but in sociological terms, and almost management technique terms. And I just wondered what you could say about the connection, if anything, between that and what you've been talking about.
So that's Jacob.
Thanks for that, Bruno. I wish some of my contemporaries and peers in universities could have a historical appreciation of that. And the thing that springs to mind was obviously the Occupy movement. But the point I wanted to ask was, for me, there seems to be the two levels of work. There's the in what you're saying, there's the immediate level where the politics was coming up against
contradiction, which mean it almost was forced is too strong, but it was led towards politics on reason, as you call it, and there's that sort of one level. And I think there's a second level that's operating where the very concepts that allowed politics to happen, and Hannah Arendt talks about them in Between Past and Future, authority, tradition, and to an extent religion. Those are the concepts that are falling apart as well. And so there's, as I think there's those two levels which make that tendency towards politics to take the form that it did. I was wondering, is there we don't want to be determinist, but is there any other form that politics at that time could have taken, given the historical trends that are going on?
Right, there's Stuart right at the back, I think. That's in the back. Yeah.
I'm interested in what Bruno said as well in terms of the specifics of America and the nature of politics, the state of structures, in terms of how these things panned out. Because I suppose I tend to see things as
just a bit louder, please.
I tend to see things, I suppose, perhaps as a little bit inevitable in terms of understanding the general trend. So, two key books that I've looked at is Kenneth Keniston's Youth and Dissent, so that's 1960, where he brilliantly describes the American middle class elite students no longer wanting to become adults, in essence, that they don't want to, they constantly want to be on the move, they don't want to settle down, and he looks at this sort of psychological dimension reasonably correctly, I think, in terms of what he's trying to look at. So he looks at that. And then you've got James Q. Wilson, I think it's Thinking About Crime in 1973, I think it is, which is fascinating, not because the book itself is that interesting, it's quite technical about crime, but he, in essence, at the start says, basically, America is never going to be moral again, and all we can do now is try and limit the damage by focusing on victims of crime. So he shifts under that. So, and then what's interesting in terms of what the outcome of this, and could things being changed, you get Joel Best's look at this very nicely in terms of how what you get in the 1970s is the victim becomes the framework of organising around just about everything. Which is interesting because the victim is something outside of society. The victim is like saying society is acting on us. And it's as if everybody is pointing at this thing, society, as if it's an alien thing, from right, left, saying, so everyone's like the silent majority or minority pointing at this big bad thing at society. So that seems to be the outcome in America in terms of how it pans out. So in essence, it's like the death of the subject playing itself out through the decline of enlightened liberalism and conservatism in America.
So yeah.
It's just the Ayn Rand book, which I must admit I've spoken about. Really listening to that, even though it's a Springfield Herald in a few
Can you
places.
shout a bit?
The thing that I thought was really interesting in that book is that she describes the student movement and its absurdity quite well, but she's also got this bit where she's having a go at the Philosophical Society and their meetings, and it's mainly a critique of their lack of balls, basically, that they give in to the students on every occasion you can see. But I thought it was also interesting because it's about the concession to the destruction of knowledge and the very explicit attack on reason. That you didn't really talk about that, and I don't know, do they have to rely upon French philosophy to do that? Does that discussion about the attack on reason as well as on the moral authority of the American elite take place in America, or is it something that's left to French philosophy to undertake on them?
So I'm actually going to take two hands here, starting with Joe, and then come to the front.
So, just an example of how all the preoccupation with psychology and the kind of negative aspect of that was as much embodied in the establishment as elsewhere is the example of the Unabomber, which people may know in the kind of 1980s. He started sending bombs to universities and airlines, kind of anti-technology terrorism, culminating in the newspapers publishing his kind of extended deep green manifesto as a result of blackmail. And as a result of that, he was recognised, and the police went and arrested him in his kind of log cabin isolated away from kind of civilization. So if you look at where he came from, you know, he was one of these elite students who you would kind of expect the establishment to have kind of incorporated as the next generation in the early 60s. But in fact, the experience he went through was a program which the CIA had set up in response to the Korean War, and their concern there with brainwashing, which was a kind of big panic in relation to the troops who went to Korea, the kind of propaganda that the kind of Koreans put to the captured soldiers, which pretty much consisted of maps showing here are the US bases, here are the North Korea, or here are the Korean bases, you know, who's invading who. This was kind of the response of the US establishment, that, you know, this brainwashing psychological tactics. The CIA started to kind of run brainwashing experiments on the kind of next generation, which should have become the elite, including Ted Kaczynski, who went on to kind of react. First of all, he became a professor at Berkeley, but then kind of became an anti-technology terrorist. And I'm not suggesting that kind of what the kind of program of kind of drugs and torture that he went through as a kind of student excuses him from a kind of responsibility. I think he can fully take responsibility for his actions. But nonetheless, I think it kind of shows what he was responding to, and the kind of incapacity of the US elite to kind of create a new elite generation.
Okay, yeah. Do you want to comment?
Well, I just thought it's very interesting to see that 68 was so many different things in different places, but at the same time, of course, the essential elements, as described so excellently by Bruno, still nonetheless are the same. But in Germany, for example, of course, the superficial political development of the movement was a completely different one, just to call that to mind, because it's quite different, in the sense that the 68 students basically went in three directions, didn't they? There was a massive insurge into the Social Democratic Party in 1972, which basically rejuvenated that apparatus tremendously. Then a lot of them, of course, incredible numbers, I'd say 50 to 100,000, were in Stalinist, Marxist, Leninist organizations of various stripes. I mean, we had a huge proliferation of left-wing newspapers, incredible to even remember that this was the case about 40 years ago. And then, of course, you had the Red Army faction, who was the really sort of German weathermen type people, but I mean, of course, they were minuscule. And the way it all kind of came together again, then later in the founding of the Green Party, I mean, which was done by the Leninist sort of types or Stalinist types, then had a, you know, again, profoundly transforming effect on the whole political scene in Germany right to this day. And I think that's something to consider, how this evolved. I'm not quite sure how it actually then evolved post 1968, let's say in America, exactly through which channels the ideas then went to become so firmly established, whereas in Germany it's fairly clear to me to see how it went through these different levels.
Thanks very much. Yeah, you here, and I'm going to go to Daniel when immediately guy behind.
Yeah, well, it's really good. There's loads of stuff I'd like to say, but just a couple of quick points. First of all, I think you're right. You have to distinguish between the civil rights movement and everything. The civil rights movement was a properly organised political campaign, well orchestrated, using media, which of course nobody else, you know, the televisions and everybody's had covering, and we're exploiting those new media and all the rest of it. Whereas, you know, what was going on the campus was 190 students finding an excuse for having a shag. So I think, you know, I've always respect Martin Luther, so I think I prefer those to his party. But the thing about the you know, Martin Luther's campaign and so on is that actually it was successful, and they did affect political change, and they affected political change at all sorts of levels. You know, this is a feeling that it's only in the legislature, it's only in what's enacted in the Senate, where your politics takes place, but they actually changed people's minds and perceptions and made it impossible to use certain language and to operate in certain ways. And Obama is a direct consequence of that, or is related to those trends that are set in place. But doesn't it? And the final point is, we're talking about the crisis in the elite, but it isn't really a fundamentally structural problem in the way that America organises its politics. It makes it very difficult. The elite is actually very weak. The presidency and the federal structures are very weak in what they can and can't do. And we've seen even recently in terms of the pending economic crisis, which is going to subsume the United States in the next 2 years, which has only been deflected because the EU's pulled the car. That they actually find it difficult to come to a decision. In fact, they don't have the levers that we assume that they do because we follow them as powerful as they will. And so I just want to I'd like to hear you to possibly develop on express your views on whether that sort of fundamental structural problem at the heart of the American democracy was unique at that point, was particularly worse at that point, or is just an ongoing thing.
So we're just going to come back.
Very quickly, I think that is the point I was making. I don't want to say that the civil rights movement failed. I think it was weakened at a certain moment, but it did change American society. It did change American society for the better, and the New Left weren't part of that. It was a good, solid, proper political organisation. I think that's a sort of a hint at this discussion about inevitability. But all of the things sort of described and the sort of deep unreason of the American state in the way it responded to political difficulties wasn't a complete closure of political possibility. We have to ask ourselves why certain things. Remember, Ayn Rand's book is really good as well. The Apollo comparison, she's absolutely, well, she always seems to be angry, but she's really particularly angry about the fact that the cultural event of the 1960s is this sort of Woodstock disaster, a sort of muddy field with people sort of shouting obscenities because it was raining, where they had to fly in 50 doctors from New York because they couldn't even look after themselves. And just a month before being the Apollo moon landing, she was sort of railing and saying, why do we remember these idiots? Why is that a culturally significant event? Why is it a million people who gathered at Cape Kennedy to watch the moon mission take off? And you could say that also as well about the civil rights movement. Why do we remember the Black Panthers more than people like what's her name, Hamer, who did all the hard work, did the posture regardless. Sorry.
Dan. Well, just a couple of things to throw in. First of all, was there anything positive to come out in the 1960s? I don't doubt your criticisms about you can see an embryo of the environmental movement, the anti-materialism, the rationalism, identity politics. You gave a very systematic, I completely agree with your introduction, but it was very bleak. And then other people come in and kind of hit the 1960s even more, with the exception, briefly, Sabina referring to the rise of the left, which we know is broad in different ways, and Jason refers to the gay liberation front. So, but to what extent, if you were to take a balanced view of the 60s, was there anything positive at all? Should we completely write it off, which I think some people were made in that direction. And secondly, something you alluded to, would be interesting to hear more about, was the kind of lack of mediating institutions, or underdeveloped mediating institutions in American society. So in Europe, and Britain in particular, the main case, we did have an extensive trade union movement and other forms of community policing and mediating institutions, which meant they were quite well placed to contain conflict rather than immediately go and shoot students, LSE or whatever, the British equivalent, just kind of shooting and bringing tanks. So was it just that the American establishment didn't feel the need to develop those mediating institutions, or was there some problem in doing it? How would you see that in the whole context of what's going on?
Yeah, so that time scale.
Yeah, thanks. I was in America just so recently, maybe 10 years ago, doing a dissertation on whether Bowdry I was right about America being a hyper reality, and I was getting around America in a car, And I thought, I'll pop into Nashville and do a bit of country music. Well, I couldn't park the car because I didn't understand the instructions. So I asked a couple of guys how to park the car. And one was white, one was black. And the white guy sort of wandered off, and I started talking to the black guy. And I said, how is it to be a black guy in southern states of America? Oh, he said, fine. We're getting on fine. But he said, it's a bit dodgy in the north. I said, why? He said, well, they wear the white sheet. I said, what do you mean by the white sheet? He said, well, what they speak to your face is different when they speak behind your back. And they like to do some research and find out what the white sheet was. And it's a Ku Klux Klan. That's 2001. So it's the right, and all is a part of the elite still under this white sheet.
So here, Tessa.
Yes, following on from Jacob's point, I think it's useful to look at it at two levels. You've got the political level. I think following from Jacob's point about there being two levels, a political level and another level, I think that's a useful way of looking at it, because you've got the political level, which Bruno described, which is the sort of discrediting of the elite, with their sort of loss of confidence and racial superiority and the extension of their power. But then you've also got an underlying philosophical or intellectual level, which, the way I've been thinking about it, is the crisis of the ideas of the organic society, which Elling's outlined. So, in a sense, it's like a response to this, a conception of society where there is no role for the individual. Individuals are left to ask, so where am I? Where is the individual will in our understanding of society? And I think it's quite interesting that a lot of the participants, if I'm right, of the New Left were sociology students who rejected the sort of Talcott Parsons and sort of value-free science, and were wanting to know where were the values, where was the meaning in the philosophy.
Thanks. I'm going to go to Tessa. If you want to speak, do let me know, because we'll have to round up pretty soon.
Recently it came out that the Queen allegedly did not want to give Mick Jagger a knighthood, even though he did accept one, but not from her. And obviously that's, to me, is the sort of quite recent unification of the supposed 60s drug-taking, radically seeming musician with the establishment. But nevertheless, she didn't give him a knighthood directly. Is there anything in America that the establishment still is rejecting or is influenced by these kind of cultural poses from the 60s? I know you said that the US radicals in the civil rights movement still have an influence in contemporary America, but what about all the other losers or culturally out there?
Let's go right at the back there.
It's quite a deep question, this, but in the 1960s seems to represent quite a big loss of bottle by the West, put it crudely. I mean, what's the main cause or causes behind this? Is it just demographic and post-war malaise, or is there something else at work here?
Okay, thanks.
Well, I'm going to say, I was wondering whether I was going to say this or not. I want to caution against a certain one-sidedness. This comes to me through the discussion of Black Panthers, because I remember when I was around that time, 68, I was very, very impressed by them, because they had this courage, this tremendous radicalism. They drew attention to the whole situation of black people in the United States to someone living in Europe. And yes, I even sensed at the time that some of the stuff they were saying was a little bit off, and I wouldn't have subscribed to it 100%. But I think we shouldn't be too one-sided in the sense that there can be a moment of irrationalism, if you like, in any kind of upheaval, be it cultural or more political. And so I don't think the point is to go and sort of condemn that as such, but to identify the problem more as being, if that then gets celebrated and gets cemented by the people who should actually be doing the different thing, yeah? So like, let's say around the time of the Russian Revolution, a lot of nutcases were around, pretty similar. But you had a strong political movement which was pulling, or several movements, Bolsheviks, pulling in the direction of rational politics. And of course, if all you get is this more irrational impulse, then it's going to be a real problem. But I don't think that that should lead us to condemn people like happens.
I see one last hand at the back there. Yeah.
Very quick question in relation to the points that Frank made on the first day, I think. We're looking at this in terms of a retreat. It seems like a retreat. But there was something you said which sort of suggested that the retreat into the self, can't you sort of say that's a negative thing in Boyd's history. At least within the self, there's an attempt to assert free will. I mean, and people have said positive things about French existentialism, which you haven't really. Can you comment on that point? Are we just looking at this because we think it's about retreat, or do you think there's a positive kernel in there somewhere in that process of the assertion of the self and free will, even if it's only private space?
Yeah, over to Bruno. Is there anything to be positive about?
Could you stand up, Bruno?
I think, yeah, I think, I mean, I've got the points about the two levels, very important. The American state had become unreasoned in terms of the way it responded to these people, and it was clear that at the political level, key concepts to exercise will and politics had been eroded and were collapsing like houses of cards. I think it was a very difficult time. Would have been a very difficult time to be working, I suppose, as a political person. But I certainly don't think that any outcome is ever, completely inevitable. I mean, the fascinating thing about 1960s America is the very obvious random events, these amazing assassinations. And they are pretty random. They weren't a sort of organised conspiracy by, the American state, the Zog government or anything like that. And they do seem to be sort of emerged spontaneously from the chaotic nature of American society. At that moment, of course, you could wonder, what would have happened if Martin Luther King hadn't sort of gone outside on the balcony on that evening and all the rest of it. So I don't think that we should be inevitably pessimistic about moments in history, because the same, as Sabina said and Dolan said, some of the same kind of moments were played out in other places across the world that had different circumstances, admittedly, but had different outcomes too. So that, there's always possibilities. So there's never an excuse to abdicate the fight for politics. There's never an excuse to be Jerry Rubin, basically. Is there an excuse to be Black Panthers? When I say I'm not a fan of them, I'm not saying that I can't understand their motives. And I'm not saying I can't, that one cannot appreciate their motives and frustration when you look at what was going on at the time. But I think when you look at their trajectory and their development and what they did, then it's possible to be much more critical. And I think the ideas, the absolutely ludicrous ideas of black separatism, the government of the Republic of New Africa against South Africa, I don't know why it's got everything in my head. In those days, if anyone should tell me, I'd be very interested to know. I mean, they were really ludicrous ideas, and they were unworkable. And they were unworkable because they were a product of people who had actually gone in a way the direction they were being herded by the so-called inevitable tendencies of American politics. The good things about it, one of the good things about the 1960s is that the Conservatives couldn't hold the line. In fact, I'm pretty pleased that Goldwater didn't get elected in whenever it was, 1964. I don't think it would have been a good thing if Americans had won the war in Vietnam using tactical nuclear weapons, and as General Curtis LeMay said, bomb them back to the Stone Age. I mean, really bomb them back to the Stone Age. I don't think I don't think that would have been a good thing. I think it was good for world politics, coming back a bit more to your question, good for world politics and international relations that America got a bloody nose in Vietnam. Quite frankly, I think that probably was a positive development, although as it's worked out over the decades, it looks a lot less positive in some ways at the moment. I think it's really interesting. I mean, the thing I really like about the Ayn Rand book, I mean, she's got a history and a baggage as a refugee from Russia. So she's a bit, there's always reds under the beds, and of course the reds under the beds are exactly the kind of people, the type of people. They're not these, sort of, these beautiful, passionate men who sort of whisker off, these sort of horrible, weedy sort of Jews with beards shrieking the word fuck over and over again, which she doesn't like. But I think the real strength of her, I mean, she's really rude about her. She scores some real, she's vicious. I mean, she should have been a gossip columnist or something. But I think one of the real strength of what she's writing about 1960s, and her real anger, her real fury, isn't with the New Left. She hates them anyway. We all know what she thinks of them. But is her horror at the bits of the American elite that she would actually like to defend, and the kind of institutions of authority that she would like to defend, like the university. And she sees all these academics, and basically a lot of these students are doing what they were told by their lecturers like Mills, basically. And the sort of assault on the idea of the mind, knowledge, and the university. Although again, of course, you do have to sympathise with some of these students at this sort of what do they call a multi-university, as run by this sort of bureaucratic guy, Clark Kerr in Berkeley, this huge kind of campus where actually the authorities did treat you in loco parentis, where you couldn't do what you liked because everything was owned by the college and it would stop you doing anything because it was private property. And you can sense the frustration. I mean, one of the things in the Paul Hurren statement from the SDS, this sort of the student group, was that in the university, passion was seen as unscholastic. And you can see there, you can see within some of those kinds of reactions and tensions certain possibilities there. And I think where Rand is interesting, and she does actually, I blame the elites for the fact that attempt to rebel against the university, it all goes wrong and ends up destroying the university. She blames the elite for that. I think it's one of her good insights amid all the abuse. I don't think we should completely write off people. So I wouldn't even completely write off the Black Panthers, and I wouldn't write off R.D. Laing. R.D. Laing anyway. I mean, his impulse was a positive one. He was someone who did something that not a lot of people want to do, which is spend a lot of time with paranoid schizophrenics and psychotic people, and the therapeutic communities that he set up did as experiments, and they did contribute to good practice, I think anyway. And I think The Divide itself is actually a really interesting and engaging book because it comes out of something real and practical that he was doing and grappling with through a practice. And that book is much, it's really stronger for it. It's much better actually in many ways than sort of Foucault, Madness and Civilization, because sort of Laing is living it, I suppose, practically. On mediating institutions, it's funny that since the 1960s that actually all states are looking a bit like America nowadays, and there's a lot less mediating layers when the state seeks to deal with social conflict or challenges. It does tend to be much more direct, usually sort of juridical in some way. But we should never be blind to the fact that juridical or bureaucratic, the Interstate Commerce Commission, whatever they're called, that juridical relations are always backed up with the state's resolution of that juridical decision, i.e. force. And that's one of the interesting things about America. That was one of the interesting things about Northern Ireland, is that the mediating institutions that work well in the in Britain did not work well in Northern Ireland, because the existence of a democratic opposition movement with a Republican trajectory threatened the existence of the British states. They had to react like the like the Americans did. Just finally on the finishing on the sort of their discussion about the self. I mean, I think their discussion about the self was negative because they were sort of trying to tear down the public aspect of the self, the rational aspect of the self, because they would have confused it with the unreason of rational so-called rational institutions, and they wanted to subsume or transcend their public or outer self with the sort of shrieking, Roxanne Dunbar kind of person. Now, I don't think you can actually do that, and that's why I think Trilling is so right to conclude that actually the project of stripping away your outer public self is actually impossible, because otherwise you are mad, and being mad's not a nice thing, and you probably can't even really do it to yourself. And maybe if you take enough drugs, you can't really do it to yourself. Anyway, so I think Trilling's point is really, really important, is that actually you can't escape from the social necessity of having a public self that you use to engage with reality. You can't dispense with that. That is a social necessity. It's just a necessity. It's a given that we need to do this. It's sort of the same at all different times. And the idea of pretending that you can, the absolute rejection of that, is really a flight from moral responsibility, a flight from moral authority. And when society takes up those ideas, society abrogates moral authority, then it sets in train even further kind of problems. And I think the Trilling book, which is a wonderful book, it's about literature mainly, but it's a wonderful book. The last chapter on authenticity and consciousness is really, truly great bit of truly great bit of writing by a great mind. And I think it's right.
Thanks very much, Bruno.